The monitors screamed their digital warnings as 8-year-old Emma Sterling's heart rate plummeted to dangerous levels. Outside, December's blizzard hammered the Colorado mountainside, trapping them all in this mansion that had become a tomb. Alexander Sterling pressed his face against the frost-covered window, watching headlights cut through the storm. The new caregiver had arrived. 3 months, Dr. Whitmore had said. Maybe less. Emma's breathing grew shallower. Her once golden hair lay in brittle strands across the pillow. The experimental treatments weren't working. Nothing was working. The doorbell's echo seemed to mock the silence that had swallowed their home since Sarah's death. Alexander descended the marble staircase, each step heavier than the last. When he opened the door, a young woman stood there, snow clinging to her dark coat. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Grace Miller." As she stepped inside, Emma's weak voice drifted from upstairs. "Mama." "Is that you, Mama?" Grace froze. Alexander's blood turned to ice. Emma had never spoken to anyone that way before. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Alexander Sterling had built an empire worth $12 billion, but money couldn't buy what he needed most. Standing in the marble foyer of his Colorado estate, he studied the woman who'd answered his desperate job posting. Grace Miller looked younger than her 28 years, with tired eyes that spoke of recent grief. Her references were impeccable. Pediatric nursing background, experience with terminal cases. What struck him wasn't her qualifications, but the way she'd reacted to Emma's voice. "That's my daughter," Alexander said, his voice rough from months of sleepless nights. "She doesn't usually respond to strangers." Grace removed her snow-covered coat, revealing scrubs beneath, navy blue with tiny stars. "How long has she been ill?" 6 months since the diagnosis. Dr. Whitmore says it's a rare degenerative condition. Her motor functions are declining, cognitive abilities fading. Alexander's hands clenched. "Every specialist we've consulted confirms it." "There's no cure." The mansion felt like a mausoleum. Expensive medical equipment hummed throughout the house. Oxygen concentrators, IV stands, monitoring devices that beeped constantly. Grace followed Alexander up the grand staircase, past family portraits that seemed to watch their ascent. The final photo showed a beautiful woman with Emma's golden hair. "Your wife?" "Sarah died 3 years ago. Car accident." Alexander's jaw tightened. Emma barely remembers her. Emma's room was a shrine to childhood. Stuffed animals, art supplies, books she could no longer read. The 8-year-old lay propped against pillows, skeletal fingers clutching a worn teddy bear. When Grace entered, Emma's dulled eyes suddenly brightened. "You came back," Emma whispered, reaching out with trembling hands. Grace instinctively moved closer, taking Emma's cold fingers in her warm ones. "I'm Grace. I'm here to take care of you. I knew you would come. I drew you." Emma pointed to papers scattered across her nightstand, crayon drawings of a dark-haired woman holding a little girl's hand. Alexander frowned. "She's been drawing constantly since the illness progressed. Dr. Whitmore says it's common. Patients often retreat into fantasy." Grace studied the drawings more carefully. They showed remarkable detail for a sick child. The woman's face was clearly defined, wearing the same star-patterned scrubs Grace had chosen that morning. A chill ran down her spine. "When did she draw these?" "Last week. She kept saying Mama's coming home for Christmas." Alexander's voice cracked. "We thought it was confusion." Emma squeezed Grace's hand with surprising strength. "Daddy's been so sad. But you're here now, so everything's going to be okay." Grace met Alexander's desperate gaze across the bed. Neither spoke the impossible truth hanging between them, that somehow this dying child had been waiting for a woman she'd never met. Grace's first 3 days at the Sterling estate fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. She'd wake before dawn in her guest room, watching snow accumulate against the windows while she prepared for another day of caring for a dying child. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, she'd been planning a nursery for her own baby. Now she was watching someone else's daughter slip away. Emma's medication schedule dominated their days. Pills at 6 a.m., injections at noon, more pills at 6 p.m. Dr. Marcus Whitmore arrived punctually each morning, a distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been the Sterling family physician for over a decade, Alexander explained, trusted implicitly. Grace has excellent credentials, Alexander told the doctor during his first visit since her arrival. Pediatric nursing background. Dr. Whitmore's smile seemed forced. Wonderful. Though I should mention, Emma's condition requires very specific protocols. We can't risk any deviations. Grace nodded politely, but something in his tone bothered her. She'd worked with terminal pediatric cases before. Doctors usually welcomed experienced nurses' observations. Dr. Whitmore seemed almost defensive about Emma's treatment. The medications themselves raised questions. Grace had memorized thousands of drug names during her nursing career, but several of Emma's prescriptions were unfamiliar. When she discreetly researched them online, she found limited information. Most were listed as experimental or compassionate use only. "Daddy, the medicine tastes like metal today," Emma complained during her noon dose on the second day. Grace examined the liquid carefully. The same prescription bottle, same manufacturer's label, but the color seemed slightly different, more yellow than the clear solution from yesterday. "Doctor." Whitmore adjusted the compound, Alexander explained when Grace mentioned it. "He's trying a new approach." But when Grace checked Emma's medical chart later, she found no notation about formula changes. In fact, several pages seemed to be missing entirely. The documentation was sparse for such a complex case. Emma's behavior puzzled Grace too. Despite her supposed cognitive decline, the child showed remarkable insight. She'd comment on conversations she shouldn't have overheard, predict visitors before they arrived, and ask questions that seemed far too sophisticated for her age. "Grace," Emma said on the third evening as Grace tucked her into bed, "do you think people can love someone they've never met?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Like how I loved you before you came here. I knew you were my mama, even though Daddy says my real mama is in heaven." Grace's throat tightened. "Sometimes our hearts recognize kindness, even from strangers. But you're not a stranger. You're the mama who was supposed to come back." Emma's eyes, though sunken, burned with certainty. "I dreamed about you every night. You were crying because your baby went to heaven too." Grace's breath caught. She'd never mentioned her miscarriage to anyone at the estate. "How did you—" "I see things sometimes, like how Daddy cries in his office when he thinks nobody's watching, and how Dr. Whitmore talks to someone on his phone in the basement but there's no one there." The basement. Grace had noticed Dr. Whitmore disappearing downstairs during his visits, claiming he needed to check medical supplies, but the main medical storage was on the second floor. "Emma, what else do you see?" The child's expression grew troubled. "Bad things. The medicine isn't helping me get better. It's making me sick, so I'll need more medicine. Like a circle that never stops." Grace felt ice in her veins. "What do you mean?" "The man in the white coat. In my dreams, he's not trying to save me. He's trying to—" Emma's voice trailed off, and she suddenly looked confused, younger. "I don't remember. The thoughts go away when I take the yellow pills." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She reviewed everything she'd observed, the inconsistent medications, the missing chart pages, Emma's disturbing insights, Dr. Whitmore's secretive behavior. As a nurse, she'd learned to trust her instincts about patient care. Every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. She crept downstairs around midnight, intending to examine Emma's medications more closely. The house was silent, except for the hum of medical equipment and the whisper of wind through the mountains. Alexander's office door was closed, but she could see light underneath. In the kitchen, Grace opened the medication refrigerator. Emma's injections were stored in small vials with handwritten labels, unusual for prescription drugs, which typically came in commercial packaging. She photographed the labels with her phone, planning to research them more thoroughly. A sound from the basement made her freeze. Footsteps. Dr. Whitmore was supposed to have left hours ago. Grace moved carefully toward the basement door, which she'd assumed was locked. It opened silently. Soft light emanated from below, along with the sound of someone speaking in low, urgent tones. "The subject is responding as predicted," a man's voice said. Grace recognized Dr. Whitmore's cultured accent. Muscle weakness increased by 30% this week. Cognitive function declining on schedule. Subject? Grace's blood chilled. He was talking about Emma like a laboratory specimen. No complications with the new caregiver," Dr. Whitmore continued. "She's just a grief-stricken woman looking for purpose." "Won't be a problem." Grace backed away from the door, her heart hammering. She had to tell Alexander immediately, but as she turned toward his office, she heard Emma's weak voice calling from upstairs. "Mama Grace, I had another bad dream." Grace rushed upstairs to Emma's room, her mind reeling from what she'd overheard in the basement. The child was sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, clutching her teddy bear against her chest. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Grace sat on the edge of the bed, automatically checking Emma's pulse and breathing. Both seemed more labored than usual. "I dreamed about the bad doctor again," Emma whispered. "He was putting poison in my medicine. And there were other children. They were all sleeping forever." Grace's blood ran cold. "Emma, listen to me carefully. Has Dr. Whitmore ever given you medicine when your daddy wasn't here?" Emma nodded slowly. "Sometimes he comes at night. He says it's special medicine to help me sleep better, but it makes me feel worse, not better." "When was the last time?" "Tonight, before you came upstairs." Emma's voice was barely audible. "He said not to tell Daddy because it would make him worry." Grace's nursing instincts kicked into overdrive. She examined Emma's arms and found a small injection site on her left forearm, barely visible but unmistakably fresh. Her hands shook as she realized the implications. "Emma, I need you to do something very important for me. Can you pretend to be asleep if Dr. Whitmore comes back?" The child nodded, though her eyes showed fear beyond her years. "Are you going to save me, Mama Grace?" "I'm going to try, baby. I promise I'm going to try." Grace waited until Emma's breathing evened out, then crept down the hallway toward Alexander's office. Light still glowed beneath his door. She knocked softly. "Come in." Alexander's voice was hoarse with exhaustion. He sat behind his mahogany desk, surrounded by financial documents and medical reports. His normally pristine appearance was disheveled, shirt wrinkled, tie loose, dark circles under his eyes. He looked up as Grace entered, and she saw something break in his expression. "She's getting worse, isn't she?" he said quietly. "I can see it in your face." Grace closed the door behind her. "Alexander, we need to talk. About Dr. Whitmore." His posture stiffened. "What about him? Marcus has been our family doctor for years. He delivered Emma, treated my wife." Alexander's voice caught. "He's been trying everything to save her." "I don't think he is." Grace sat across from him, choosing her words carefully. "I overheard him tonight. He was in the basement talking about Emma like she was a test subject." Alexander's face darkened. "That's impossible. You must have misunderstood. He called her the subject, said her condition was progressing on schedule, Alexander, those aren't the words of a doctor trying to cure a patient. You've been here 3 days. Alexander's voice rose, defensive and desperate. Marcus has been part of our family for over a decade. He held Emma when she was born. He was at Sarah's funeral. He's the only one who's given us any hope. Grace pulled out her phone, showing him the photographs of the medication vials. These aren't standard prescription drugs. Most of them are experimental compounds. And Emma just told me Dr. Whitmore gave her an injection tonight without your knowledge. Alexander stared at the images, his face pale. He said he was trying new treatments, cutting-edge protocols that might help when conventional medicine failed. Alexander, listen to me. I've worked with terminal pediatric cases for years. Emma's symptoms don't match her supposed diagnosis. They match something else entirely. Systematic poisoning. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Alexander's hands trembled as he reached for Emma's medical file, flipping through pages with growing horror. The missing documentation, he whispered. I asked Marcus about gaps in her chart. He said detailed records weren't necessary for experimental treatments. A legitimate doctor keeps detailed records especially for experimental treatments, Grace said gently. Alexander, I think someone has been deliberately making Emma sick. Alexander's composure finally cracked. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms and built empires crumbled before her eyes. No, that's not possible. Marcus he couldn't. We need to call the police tonight. With what proof? Suspicious medications and a caregiver's hunches? Alexander's voice turned bitter. Do you know what kind of connections Marcus has? What kind of reputation? Who's going to believe us? Grace stood up, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. Then we take Emma and leave. Right now. Get her to a hospital in Denver, away from Dr. Whitmore's influence. In this storm, the roads are impassable. We're completely cut off until the plows come through. As if summoned by their conversation, the basement door creaked open. Footsteps echoed through the house, measured, confident, approaching. Dr. Whitmore's voice called out cheerfully. Alexander, I saw your lights were still on. Thought I'd check on our little patient before heading home. Grace and Alexander stared at each other in horror. They'd been discovered. I need to go to Emma, Grace whispered urgently. Wait. Alexander grabbed her arm. If you're right about this, if Marcus is really... He couldn't finish the sentence. We need to be smart. Play along until we figure out how to get Emma away from him. Dr. Whitmore's footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Everything all right up there? Alexander cleared his throat, forcing normalcy into his voice. Fine, Marcus. Just going over some business documents. Grace was updating me on Emma's evening routine. Excellent. Mind if I look in on her? I brought some additional medication that might help with her discomfort tonight. Grace felt sick. More medication, more poison disguised as treatment. Alexander met her eyes, and she saw her own terrible understanding reflected there. They were trapped in this house with a man who might be slowly murdering his daughter, and until the storm cleared, there was nowhere to run. The next 72 hours became a careful dance of deception and growing horror. Grace and Alexander had to maintain the pretense that everything was normal while secretly investigating Dr. Whitmore's activities. The blizzard continued to rage outside, trapping them all in the mansion with a man they now suspected of unspeakable crimes. Grace established a new routine that allowed her to monitor Emma's medications more closely. She convinced Alexander to request that all treatments be administered in his presence, citing her nursing background and desire to learn the protocols. Dr. Whitmore seemed initially resistant but eventually agreed, though Grace noticed his jaw tighten when she asked technical questions about dosages and drug interactions. These compounds are quite specialized, Dr. Whitmore explained during one morning visit, preparing Emma's injection with practiced efficiency. The pharmaceutical company requires very specific handling procedures. Which company manufactures them? Grace asked innocently, noting how he turned the vial away from her view. Meridian Research. They're developing breakthrough treatments for rare pediatric conditions. His answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. Grace nodded politely, but later searched extensively for Meridian Research online. She found a basic website with minimal information and no verifiable contact details. The company appeared to exist only on paper. Meanwhile, Alexander used his business connections to quietly investigate Dr. Whitmore's background. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The doctor's previous practice in California had been investigated by the state medical board following an unusual number of childhood deaths among wealthy families. The investigation had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but the pattern was disturbing. "Grace," Alexander said one evening after Emma had fallen asleep, "I found records of 7 children who died under Marcus's care over the past 5 years, all from affluent families, all diagnosed with rare, untreatable conditions." They were sitting in his office, speaking in whispers, both terrified of being overheard. Grace had begun to notice small surveillance devices throughout the house, tiny cameras hidden in smoke detectors, microphones that seemed too sophisticated for a private residence. "There's something else," Grace said, pulling out a notebook where she'd been documenting Emma's symptoms. "I've been tracking her reactions to different medications. When I accidentally gave her the wrong dosage yesterday, a smaller amount, her symptoms actually improved for several hours." Alexander stared at the careful charts Grace had created. "You're saying the medicine is making her worse?" "I'm saying the medicine is making her sick, period." "Alexander, I don't think Emma has a degenerative disease. I think she's being systematically poisoned." The weight of that revelation settled between them like a death sentence. If Grace was right, then Dr. Whitmore had been slowly murdering Emma while presenting himself as her savior. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. But why? Alexander's voice broke. Why would he do this to a child, to us? Grace had been wondering the same thing. There has to be something deeper, some motivation we're not seeing. Their investigation took on new urgency. Alexander began accessing Dr. Whitmore's financial records through his business intelligence contacts, while Grace continued her careful observation of Emma's medical routine. What they discovered painted a picture of systematic fraud and unimaginable cruelty. Dr. Whitmore was receiving substantial payments from multiple sources: pharmaceutical companies, private research foundations, and individuals whose identities were carefully hidden behind shell corporations. The amounts were staggering, far more than any legitimate medical consultation could justify. "He's not just poisoning Emma," Alexander realized, studying the financial documents. "He's running clinical trials on children without consent, using wealthy families as unwitting test subjects." Grace felt sick. The parents pay him enormous fees to save their children, never knowing he's the one making them sick in the first place. Emma's condition became the center of their covert resistance. Grace began carefully reducing medication dosages whenever possible, documenting Emma's improvements when less poison entered her system. The child's innate intelligence began reasserting itself, though she remained weak from months of systematic abuse. "Mama Grace," Emma said one afternoon, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "I remember more things now. Like how Daddy used to read me stories every night before I got sick, and how Mommy used to sing lullabies." Alexander looked puzzled. "Emma, sweetheart, you were very young when Mommy died. You've never talked about remembering her before, because the medicine made me forget. But now the fog is going away." Emma's eyes were clearer, more focused. "Mama Grace, Dr. Whitmore isn't trying to help me, is he? Grace exchanged a look with Alexander. The child was beginning to understand her own situation. No, baby, Grace said gently. He's not. Are you going to stop him? We're going to try. That evening, Dr. Whitmore arrived for his usual visit, carrying his medical bag and wearing his practiced expression of concerned professionalism. Grace and Alexander maintained their careful charade, but both were hyper-aware of every movement, every word. "How is our little patient today?" Dr. Whitmore asked, approaching Emma's bedside with his familiar smile. "Better," Emma said clearly, meeting his eyes with startling directness. "Much better." Something flickered across Dr. Whitmore's face, surprise, perhaps concern. "Well, that's wonderful to hear, though we mustn't get our hopes up too high. These conditions often have temporary improvements before—" "Before what?" Alexander asked sharply. "Before the inevitable progression continues," Dr. Whitmore finished smoothly. "I'm afraid tonight's treatment will need to be more aggressive. I've developed a new compound that should help manage Emma's discomfort." Grace watched him prepare a syringe with an unusually large amount of liquid. Her nursing experience told her this dosage was dangerous for a child Emma's size, regardless of what the compound contained. "Dr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "that seems like a significant increase in volume. Should we be concerned about potential reactions?" His smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. "Miss Miller, while I appreciate your nursing background, Emma's case requires specialized knowledge that goes well beyond standard pediatric care. I think it's best if you allow me to proceed without interference." Alexander stepped closer to Emma's bed. "Actually, I'd like Grace to stay. As Emma's father, I want all her caregivers to understand her treatment protocols." "Of course," Dr. Whitmore said, though his grip on the syringe tightened. "Though I should mention, this particular compound can cause some initial distress. It might be upsetting for inexperienced observers to witness." Grace felt alarm bells ringing in her mind. "What kind of distress? Temporary seizure activity? Respiratory depression? Nothing dangerous, of course, but potentially alarming to watch." Grace's blood turned to ice. He was describing symptoms that could easily mask a lethal overdose. If Emma went into respiratory failure after this injection, Dr. Whitmore could claim it was an expected side effect while actually committing murder. "I don't think—" Grace began. "Daddy?" Emma's small voice cut through the tension. "I'm scared." Alexander looked down at his daughter, then at the syringe in Dr. Whitmore's hand, then at Grace's terrified expression. In that moment, 3 months of desperate trust in his family doctor shattered completely. "Don't touch her," Alexander said quietly. Dr. Whitmore's mask of professional concern slipped slightly. "Alexander, I understand this is difficult, but Emma needs this treatment. Without it, she'll deteriorate rapidly." "She's been deteriorating since you started treating her," Grace said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Every injection, every pill, she gets worse instead of better. That's the nature of her condition." "She doesn't have a condition," Alexander interrupted, moving to stand protectively between Dr. Whitmore and Emma's bed. "She has a doctor who's been poisoning her." The pretense finally dropped completely. "Doctor." Whitmore's expression turned cold, calculating. He was no longer the kindly family physician. He was something else entirely, something dangerous trapped in a room with the family he'd been systematically destroying. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Dr. Whitmore said softly. "This work is bigger than one child, bigger than one family. The research we're conducting will eventually save thousands of lives." "By murdering children?" Grace's voice shook with rage. by advancing medical science through controlled trials. Emma's contribution to this research will have lasting value, which is more than can be said for most lives. Alexander lunged forward, but Dr. Whitmore was ready. The syringe came up between them, its needle gleaming in the lamplight. "Now," Dr. Whitmore said calmly, "we're going to complete Emma's treatment. And if anyone interferes, there will be consequences for this entire family." The syringe gleamed like a blade in the soft lamplight as Dr. Whitmore held it between himself and Alexander. Emma's weak gasp broke the terrible silence, and Grace instinctively moved closer to the bed, positioning herself as a shield between the child and the man who had been slowly killing her. "You're insane," Alexander said, his voice deadly calm. "You've been experimenting on my daughter, on children." "I've been advancing medical science," Dr. Whitmore replied, his cultured voice never wavering. "Every great breakthrough requires sacrifice. Your daughter's contribution will help develop treatments that could save thousands of children in the future." By murdering her? By studying disease progression in controlled conditions, Emma's case has provided invaluable data about cellular degeneration, pain response, and treatment resistance. Dr. Whitmore spoke as if discussing a laboratory specimen, not a living child. "Her sacrifice serves a greater purpose." Grace felt rage building in her chest like a physical force. "She's 8 years old. She trusts you. Her father trusted you." "Trust is irrelevant. Results matter." Dr. Whitmore's eyes moved to Emma, who was watching the confrontation with frightening clarity. "The compound in this syringe represents months of careful calibration. One injection will complete the study while appearing to be a natural progression of her illness." "You're talking about murder," Alexander said. "I'm talking about science." Emma's small voice cut through their standoff like a knife. "Dr. Whitmore, why do you want to hurt me?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment his clinical mask slipped, revealing something raw and wounded underneath. "Because someone has to pay," he said quietly. "Someone has to understand what it feels like to watch a child die while knowing you can't save them." Grace saw the crack in his armor and pressed forward. "What happened to you? What made you like this?" Dr. Whitmore's hand trembled slightly, but the syringe remained steady. "I had a son once. Michael. He was 7 years old when he was diagnosed with leukemia. Brilliant child, full of life and questions and dreams." His voice grew distant. "I was just a resident then, making $30,000 a year and drowning in medical school debt." Alexander kept his eyes fixed on the syringe, but Grace could see he was listening, trying to understand the monster in their midst. "The treatment Michael needed cost $200,000, Dr. Whitmore continued. "Experimental therapy, not covered by insurance. I begged every bank, every family member, every colleague. I even approached wealthy patients, offering to work for free in exchange for loans." "What happened?" Grace asked softly. "Nothing happened. Michael died while I watched families like yours buy their children's lives with pocket change." The bitterness in his voice was corrosive. "Alexander Sterling writes a check for experimental treatment without thinking twice. I watched my son waste away because I couldn't afford to save him." Emma's eyes filled with tears, not for herself, but for the pain she heard in Dr. Whitmore's voice. "I'm sorry your little boy died." The simple compassion in her words seemed to hit Dr. Whitmore like a physical blow. His composure cracked further. "You don't understand," he said, though his voice was less certain. "Your father has billions. He could buy a hospital, fund a research institute, save hundreds of children. But instead he hoards his wealth while children like Michael die." "So you decided to kill his daughter?" Grace's voice carried both fury and incredulity. "I decided to show him what loss feels like. To make him understand that money can't buy everything, that privilege doesn't protect you from real suffering." Alexander took a step forward. You want me to suffer? Fine. I've been suffering every day since my wife died, every day since Emma got sick. But killing my daughter won't bring your son back. It will balance the scales. No, Emma said firmly, struggling to sit up in bed despite her weakness. It will just make you the same as the people who let your little boy die. Dr. Whitmore stared at her, this fragile child who was supposed to be his victim, but instead was offering him wisdom he couldn't accept. You're just a child. You don't understand the complexities. I understand that you're sad, Emma interrupted. And I understand that hurting me won't make you feel better. It will just make you sadder. Grace watched something break inside Dr. Whitmore. His certainty, his righteousness, his carefully constructed justification for months of cruelty, all of it crumbling in the face of a dying child's forgiveness. I can't stop now, he whispered. Too much depends on this research. Other children are counting on the data. What other children? Alexander demanded. The next phase of trials. There are 6 more subjects lined up, all from wealthy families. Children whose parents can afford the treatments but choose to spend their money on luxuries instead. Grace felt sick. You're planning to poison 6 more children? I'm planning to advance medical science while teaching valuable lessons about privilege and responsibility. You're planning mass murder, Alexander said flatly. Dr. Whitmore's grip on the syringe tightened. Emma's injection happens tonight. The rest of you can choose to understand its necessity or suffer the consequences of interference. That's when Grace noticed Emma's hand moving slowly toward the call button that would summon emergency services. The child was trying to help, even while facing her own death. But Dr. Whitmore saw the movement too. His expression turned cold again, professional detachment replacing momentary vulnerability. I'm afraid we can't have any interruptions, he said, reaching over to disconnect the emergency call system. This procedure requires complete concentration. Alexander lunged forward, but Dr. Whitmore was ready. The syringe came up toward Emma's arm as Grace threw herself across the bed, putting her body between the needle and the child. The syringe pierced Grace's shoulder instead, its contents emptying into her bloodstream. She gasped as fire spread through her veins, but held her position over Emma. "Grace!" Alexander tackled Dr. Whitmore, sending both men crashing to the floor. Emma was crying now, reaching for Grace, who was already feeling the effects of whatever poison had been meant for the child. Her vision blurred and her breathing became labored, but she managed to speak. "Emma, baby. The phone. Call 911. Dr. Whitmore broke free from Alexander's grip, his face twisted with rage. "You've ruined everything! Months of research. Destroyed." He reached for another vial from his medical bag, but Alexander grabbed a heavy bookend from Emma's nightstand and brought it down hard. Dr. Whitmore collapsed, blood pooling beneath his head. Grace's world was spinning, darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision, but she could hear Emma's brave voice on the phone, clearly and calmly giving their address to the emergency dispatcher. "My daddy's friend is hurt, and the bad doctor tried to give me poison, but Mama Grace saved me," Emma was saying. "Please hurry. Mama Grace is sick now, and I think she might die." Alexander knelt beside Grace, checking her pulse, trying to assess her condition. "Stay with us, Grace. Help is coming." "Emma," Grace whispered. "Is she safe?" "She's safe. You saved her." Grace tried to smile but felt consciousness slipping away. The last thing she heard was Emma's voice, stronger than it had been in months, telling the emergency dispatcher exactly what had happened and where to find them. The poison that was meant to kill a child was now coursing through Grace's system instead. As darkness took her, she felt a profound peace knowing that Emma would live, that Alexander would protect her, and that the monster who had terrorized their family was finally stopped. But even as she faded, Grace couldn't know that her sacrifice had triggered a chain of events that would reveal truths none of them were prepared to face. The next 48 hours blurred together in a haze of sirens, hospital corridors, and devastating revelations. Grace lay unconscious in the intensive care unit, her body fighting the cocktail of experimental drugs that had been meant for Emma. Alexander refused to leave her bedside, holding vigil while Emma recovered in the pediatric ward under heavy police protection. Dr. Whitmore survived Alexander's blow, but remained in a medically induced coma, his brain swelling from the trauma. Federal investigators descended on the Sterling estate like locusts, cataloging evidence and uncovering a conspiracy that reached far beyond one deranged doctor's quest for revenge. Detective Sarah Chen was the lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in medical crimes. She interviewed Alexander in the hospital cafeteria, while Grace's condition remained critical. "Mr. Sterling, we found extensive evidence of Dr. Whitmore's activities," Detective Chen said, spreading photographs across the table. "The basement laboratory you mentioned contained detailed records of his experiments. There are files on dozens of children from wealthy families across the country." Alexander stared at the photos with growing horror. Charts tracking children's decline, chemical formulas for various poisons, financial records showing payments from pharmaceutical companies for research data. "How many?" Alexander's voice was barely audible. "We've identified 17 children who died under Dr. Whitmore's care over the past 7 years. All from affluent families, all diagnosed with rare, untreatable conditions that we now know were artificially induced." The number hit Alexander like a physical blow. Emma could have been the 18th. "But that's not the worst part," Detective Chen continued. "We found correspondence suggesting Dr. Whitmore was part of a larger network. Other doctors, other locations, all conducting similar experiments." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. "How is that possible? How did no one notice? Wealthy families don't usually question expensive medical care. When you can afford the best doctors and treatments, you assume you're getting them. Dr. Whitmore exploited that trust systematically." Emma appeared in the cafeteria doorway holding a nurse's hand. She'd been asking to see her father every hour, and the medical staff had finally agreed she was strong enough for a brief visit. "Daddy?" Emma's voice was stronger than it had been in months, though she still looked fragile in her hospital gown. "Is Mama Grace going to be okay?" Alexander knelt down and pulled his daughter into his arms. "The doctors are doing everything they can, sweetheart." "I need to tell her something," Emma said urgently. "About the dreams. They're different now." Detective Chen looked puzzled, but Alexander understood. Emma's dreams had been her way of processing the trauma and poison-induced hallucinations she'd experienced during months of abuse. "What do you see now, baby?" "I see Mama Grace waking up, but there's something else, something about her she doesn't remember." Emma's eyes were wide with the intensity of whatever vision or memory was surfacing. "She's not just Grace Miller. She has another name, too." Detective Chen leaned forward with interest. "Emma, what other name?" "I don't know exactly, but in my dreams, Dr. Whitmore calls her something else. He's crying and saying he's sorry to someone named Sarah." Alexander felt ice in his veins. "Sarah was my wife's name. My wife who died 3 years ago." "Mr. Sterling," Detective Chen said carefully, "we haven't been able to locate any records of Grace Miller's background prior to 6 months ago. Her nursing credentials check out, but it's as if she appeared out of nowhere. No previous addresses, no family contacts, no medical history." The implications hung in the air like a death sentence. Alexander thought about Grace's immediate connection with Emma, her instinctive knowledge of their family dynamics, her nursing skills that seemed almost too perfect for their situation. "You think she's connected to Dr. Whitmore somehow?" Alexander asked. "I think we need to find out who Grace Miller really is." They returned to Grace's bedside, where monitors tracked her vital signs and IV drips fed antidotes into her bloodstream. She looked peaceful despite the tubes and wires, her dark hair spread across the white pillow. Emma climbed onto the chair beside Grace's bed and took her hand. "Mama Grace, you need to wake up now. There are things we need to talk about." As if responding to the child's voice, Grace's eyelids fluttered. Alexander called for the nurse, who rushed in to check her pupils and reflexes. "Grace?" Alexander said softly. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then finding his face. "Emma? Is she? She's safe. You saved her." Grace tried to sit up but winced as pain shot through her shoulder where the syringe had pierced her. "Dr. Whitmore?" "In custody. Grace, there are things we need to discuss about who you are." Confusion clouded her features. "I don't understand." Detective Chen stepped forward. "Miss Miller, we've been investigating your background. We can't find any records of your existence prior to 6 months ago." Grace's face went pale. "That's impossible. I have a nursing license, a social security number, employment records." "All fabricated," Detective Chen said gently. "Very professionally done, but fabricated nonetheless. We need to know who you really are." Grace stared at them in bewilderment. "I'm Grace Miller. I was married to David Miller. We lost our baby, and then David died in a car accident. I came here to start over, to find purpose again." "Grace," Alexander said carefully, "Emma has been having dreams about you. She says Dr. Whitmore knows you by another name." "What name?" Emma squeezed Grace's hand. "Sarah. He keeps saying he's sorry to Sarah." The name hit Grace like an electric shock. Images flashed through her mind, fragments of memories that didn't belong to Grace Miller's life. A laboratory, a man in a white coat, pain and fear, and a desperate flight through snowy mountains. Grace pressed her hands to her temples as pieces of a different life began forcing their way through carefully constructed mental barriers. "I remember something else. Being somewhere cold, frightened, running." Detective Chen pulled out a photograph. "Do you recognize this woman?" It was a driver's license photo of a young woman with dark hair and Grace's face, but the name read Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. Grace stared at the photo in shock. "That's me." But that's not my name." "It was your name," Detective Chen said gently, "until 6 months ago, when you disappeared from a psychiatric facility in Denver. You'd been there for 2 years following a severe traumatic brain injury." The truth crashed over Grace in waves. She wasn't Grace Miller, the widowed nurse seeking purpose. She was Sarah Whitmore, Dr. Marcus Whitmore's daughter, who had discovered her father's crimes and tried to expose him before he erased her memories and created a new identity for her. "He did this to me," she whispered, the full horror of her situation becoming clear. "My own father stole my life, my memories, everything I was." Alexander took her hand. "Grace, Sarah, whatever name you choose, it doesn't matter. You saved Emma, you saved our family." But Grace was remembering more now, fragments of her real life surfacing like debris from a shipwreck. Her fiancé, David, who hadn't died in a car accident but had been murdered by her father when he threatened to expose the experiments. Her pregnancy, ended by drugs disguised as prenatal vitamins. Years of psychological conditioning designed to make her forget who she really was. "I was his daughter," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And when I tried to stop him, He destroyed me instead of his work. Emma climbed onto the bed and hugged Grace fiercely. "You're still my mama, Grace. Names don't change love." But Grace was drowning in the horror of recovered memories, understanding finally that she'd been as much Dr. Whitmore's victim as Emma had been. The man who should have protected her had stolen her identity, her memories, and her life, turning her into an unwitting accomplice in his crimes. The tragedy of their situation was complete. A father and daughter, both victims of Dr. Whitmore's madness, finding love and family in the ruins of their destroyed lives. Over the following weeks, as Grace's memories continued to surface in painful fragments, the full scope of Dr. Marcus Whitmore's crimes became horrifyingly clear. Federal investigators had arrested 3 other doctors in different states, all part of a network that had been conducting illegal human experiments on children from wealthy families for nearly a decade. Grace sat in the hospital's therapy room working with Dr. Patricia Reeves, a specialist in recovered memory syndrome. The process was excruciating. Each session brought back pieces of her stolen life, fragments of Sarah Whitmore's existence that had been systematically erased. "Tell me about David," Dr. Reeves said gently. "Your real David, not the fabricated husband from your false memories." Grace closed her eyes, letting the painful truth surface. David Chen was Detective Sarah Chen's brother. He was an investigative journalist who'd been tracking unusual child mortality rates among wealthy families. We met when he interviewed me about my father's work. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Detective Chen, who'd been investigating the case, was the sister of Grace's murdered fiancé. When the connection became clear, Detective Chen had to recuse herself from the investigation, though not before ensuring Grace that David's death would finally be avenged. "I fell in love with David because he saw what I was too blind to see," Grace continued. "My father wasn't a brilliant doctor saving children. He was killing them. When I finally understood, I tried to help David gather evidence. What happened then? Father found out. He couldn't afford to lose his daughter and his work, so he chose to keep his work." Grace's voice broke. "He killed David in a staged car accident, then convinced me I was having a breakdown from grief. The psychiatric facility, the memory treatments, the new identity, all of it was designed to turn me into someone who couldn't remember or expose him. Doctor." Reeves made careful notes. "The psychological conditioning was extremely sophisticated. Your father essentially murdered Sarah Whitmore and created Grace Miller in her place. But Grace Miller still loved children, still wanted to protect them. Even with my memories gone, some part of me knew what was right." Alexander had been attending these sessions when possible, trying to understand the woman who'd saved his daughter's life. The complexity of their situation was staggering. Grace was simultaneously the daughter of their tormentor and their salvation. "How do you feel about Alexander?" Dr. Reeves asked during one particularly difficult session. Grace looked through the window toward the pediatric wing where Emma was completing her physical therapy. "I love him. Both versions of me, Sarah and Grace, love him. But I don't know if that's real or just another form of conditioning." "What do you mean? What if my father sent me to the Sterling family knowing I'd fall in love with them? What if even my feelings are part of his experiment?" Dr. Reeves leaned forward. "Grace, your father is a narcissistic sociopath. He's not capable of the kind of emotional manipulation that would create genuine love. What you feel for Alexander and Emma comes from you, not from any programming." But Grace's doubts ran deeper than psychological conditioning. As more of her memories returned, she learned the devastating truth about her father's motivation. Dr. Whitmore hadn't just lost a son to medical inequality. He'd killed his own son during his first attempts at experimental treatment. Michael didn't die from leukemia, Grace told Alexander one evening as they sat in Emma's hospital room. He died from Father's prototype compounds. Father was already conducting illegal experiments 7 years ago, and Michael was his first test subject. Alexander felt sick. He killed his own child? Then created an elaborate fiction about medical inequality to justify continuing his work. He convinced himself that if Michael had to die for science, then other children should die too. It was never about justice, it was about hiding his original crime. Emma, who had been pretending to sleep, spoke up quietly. That's why he was so sad. He wasn't angry at rich people, he was angry at himself. Grace turned to look at the child who'd become the center of her universe. You're very wise, sweetheart. I had lots of time to think while I was sick, and I could see things in Dr. Whitmore's face that grown-ups missed. Emma sat up in bed, looking remarkably healthy after weeks of recovering from the poison. He didn't hate Daddy for having money. He hated himself for what he did to his little boy. The psychological complexity of their situation deepened when Dr. Whitmore finally emerged from his coma. Federal prosecutors wanted to interview him, but he'd suffered significant brain damage from Alexander's blow. His memories were fragmented, his speech impaired, and his ability to distinguish between reality and delusion was severely compromised. Grace made the difficult decision to visit him, hoping to find some closure or understanding. Alexander accompanied her to the maximum security medical facility where Dr. Whitmore was being held. The man who'd once been a respected physician looked broken and confused, strapped to a hospital bed with guards posted outside his door. When he saw Grace, his eyes filled with tears. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice slurred from brain damage. "My little girl, I'm so sorry." Grace sat beside his bed, her heart breaking despite everything he'd done. "Why, Father, why did you take my life away? Had to protect you, had to protect the work. Michael needed the research to continue." His words were confused, jumping between past and present. "You wouldn't understand. Too pure, too good, like your mother. I would have helped you grieve Michael properly. I would have helped you heal." Dr. Whitmore's face contorted with anguish. "No healing, no peace. Michael died because of me, so other children had to die too. Had to balance the scales." Alexander stepped forward. "You could have saved lives instead of taking them. You could have used your skills to actually help children. Tried to help, tried to save them all. But the poison was already in me, in my heart, in my hands. Everything I touched turned to death." Grace realized her father was more victim than villain, a brilliant man destroyed by guilt and grief until he became a monster. It didn't excuse his crimes, but it explained them. "I forgive you," Grace said quietly. Dr. Whitmore's eyes widened. "No, can't forgive. Mustn't forgive. The work must continue. Other fathers must pay. The work is over, Father. The children are safe now." But Dr. Whitmore had retreated into his delusions, muttering about research protocols and balancing scales. The man who'd systematically destroyed so many lives was now destroyed himself, trapped in a prison of his own madness. As they left the facility, Grace felt a strange sense of peace. He can't hurt anyone else now. "How do you feel?" Alexander asked. "Free. For the first time since recovering my memories, I feel free." Grace took his hand. "I'm not responsible for his crimes, and I'm not defined by his madness. I'm Sarah Whitmore and Grace Miller and whoever I choose to be moving forward." Back at the hospital, Emma was preparing for discharge. "I'm ready to go home." As they left the hospital together, Grace felt the last pieces of her fractured identity settling into place. She would always carry the scars of her father's crimes, but she would not be defined by them. Love had saved her just as surely as she'd saved Emma. and together they would build something beautiful from the ruins of their shattered lives. The truth had set them all free, even if that freedom came with the weight of terrible knowledge. Some wounds never fully heal, but they can be transformed into wisdom, compassion, and the determination to protect others from similar harm. 1 year later, the Sterling Mountain estate buzzed with an energy it hadn't known in decades. Wedding preparations filled every corner of the mansion as Grace and Alexander prepared to officially unite their unconventional family. Emma, now 9 and radiating health, had appointed herself chief wedding coordinator, taking her duties with the seriousness only a child could muster. "Mama Grace, your dress is beautiful, but you need more flowers in your hair," Emma declared, standing on a chair to adjust Grace's simple veil. They'd chosen to hold the ceremony at home, in the same rooms where their love had been forged through crisis and revelation. Grace smiled at her reflection in the antique mirror. She'd chosen to keep the name Grace Miller Sterling, honoring both the woman she'd been created to be and the woman she'd chosen to become. The psychological integration had been challenging, but Dr. Reeves assured her that maintaining elements of both identities was healthy. Grace Miller's compassion and Sarah Whitmore's strength combined into someone entirely new. "You look perfect," Alexander said from the doorway, handsome in his simple black suit. "Ready to make this official?" The guest list was small but meaningful. Detective Sarah Chen had become a close family friend, helping Grace process the truth about David's death while building new memories to honor her brother's legacy. Dr. Reeves attended as both friend and professional colleague. Grace had decided to return to nursing, specializing in pediatric trauma recovery. The ceremony took place in the mansion's great room, decorated with Emma's artwork and white roses from the garden Grace had planted that spring. As they exchanged vows, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "Alexander," she said, her voice steady despite her tears, "you taught me that family isn't about blood or memory or even shared history. It's about choosing to love someone every day, especially when that choice is difficult." "Grace," Alexander replied, "you saved more than Emma's life. You saved our capacity to love, to trust, to believe in tomorrow. You gave us back our future." Emma beamed from her position as flower girl and ring bearer, having insisted on handling both responsibilities. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, she cheered so loudly that everyone laughed. The reception was intimate. Local friends, business associates who'd become genuine friends during the crisis, and several families who'd been touched by Dr. Whitmore's crimes. The Sterling Foundation, established 6 months earlier, had helped fund therapy and medical care for other victims. Grace and Alexander had turned their trauma into purpose, using their resources to ensure no other families would suffer as they had. During the dinner, Emma stood up with her juice glass raised. "I want to make a toast," she announced seriously, "to Mama Grace, who taught me that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, and to Daddy, who learned that money can't buy love, but love makes everything richer. And to Dr. Whitmore's son, Michael, who's in heaven but probably happy that good things came from all the sad things." The toast was met with emotional applause. Emma's ability to find meaning in tragedy while maintaining her innocence continued to amaze the adults around her. As the evening wound down, Grace found herself on the mansion's deck, looking out over the mountains where she'd once fled in terror. Alexander joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. "About what?" "Staying with the family of your father's victims? Marrying someone whose child you were supposed to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Grace turned in his arms. "Alexander, I need you to understand something. My father created Grace Miller to be his perfect victim, someone who would love children so much she'd do anything to save them, even unknowingly participate in their destruction. But love doesn't work the way he thought it did." "What do you mean?" "He thought love was a weakness that could be manipulated. But real love, the kind we have, makes people stronger, not weaker. It makes them fight harder, risk more, choose courage over comfort. Grace smiled. My father created Grace Miller to serve his purposes, but she chose to serve love instead. Inside, Emma was showing the remaining guests her latest artwork, a series of paintings depicting their family's journey from darkness to light. The final painting showed three figures holding hands on a mountaintop, with the sun rising behind them. "She's remarkable," Detective Chen said, joining Grace and Alexander on the deck. "Most children who've experienced that level of trauma struggle for years. Emma seems to have integrated the experience into strength." "She had something to fight for," Grace said. "We all did." "What's next for the Sterling Foundation?" Alexander answered. "We're funding a new pediatric trauma center at Denver Children's Hospital. Grace will head the nursing program, training medical professionals to recognize signs of abuse that might be disguised as legitimate treatment." "And personally?" Grace and Alexander exchanged a look. "We're adopting," Grace said quietly, "a little boy whose parents were killed in a car accident. He's 5, and he reminds Emma of the brother she always wanted. His name is Michael," Alexander added. Emma insisted. Detective Chen smiled. "Dr. Whitmore would probably hate knowing his son's name is being honored by your family." "Actually," Grace said thoughtfully, "I think some part of him, the part that was still a father underneath all the madness, would be grateful. Michael's name will be associated with love and healing instead of death and revenge." The next morning, as they cleaned up from the reception, Emma made an announcement that surprised both adults. "I want to visit Dr. Whitmore," she said matter-of-factly. Grace and Alexander exchanged concerned looks. "Sweetheart, he's very sick. He might not even recognize you." "I know, but I have something to tell him." After much discussion and consultation with Dr. Reeves, they agreed to a supervised visit. Dr. Whitmore had deteriorated significantly. His brain damage had progressed, and he spent most days lost in confused memories of his son. Emma sat beside his bed with remarkable composure for a 9-year-old facing the man who'd tried to kill her. "Dr. Whitmore," she said gently, "I'm Emma. Do you remember me?" His eyes focused with difficulty. "Emma? The little girl?" "Yes. I came to tell you something important." "I'm sorry," he whispered. "So sorry. I hurt you. I hurt everyone. I know. But I want you to know that good things happened because of the bad things. Mama Grace found us because of what you did. And now we're helping other children so they won't be hurt like I was." Dr. Whitmore's eyes filled with tears. "Your mama?" "Grace is my mama now. She loves me, and Daddy loves me, and we're a real family. And tomorrow we're bringing home a little boy named Michael who needs a family too." At the mention of his son's name, Dr. Whitmore's face crumpled. "Michael? Your Michael is in heaven, but our Michael will grow up safe and loved. So your little boy's name will mean happy things instead of sad things." Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a drawing, a child's representation of a man in a white coat standing with a little boy under a rainbow. "This is for you. It's you and Michael together, where there's no sadness anymore." Dr. Whitmore clutched the drawing with shaking hands, sobbing quietly. For the first time since his breakdown, he seemed fully present, fully aware of what he'd lost and what he'd done. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for forgiving an old fool." Emma patted his hand gently. "Daddy says forgiveness isn't about forgetting bad things. It's about not letting bad things make you do more bad things." As they left the facility, Grace marveled at her daughter's wisdom. "How did you know exactly what to say to him?" "Because I understand about being sad and angry and wanting to hurt people who hurt you." but I also understand that love is stronger than hurt if you let it be. 6 months later, 5-year-old Michael Sterling settled into his new bedroom, painted by Emma in cheerful blues and yellows. The boy had been withdrawn when he first arrived, traumatized by his parents' death and suspicious of adult promises. But Emma's patient friendship and Grace's gentle care slowly drew him out of his shell. "Look, Mama Grace," Michael said one evening, showing her a drawing of stick figures under a large house. "That's our family. Me and Emma, and you and Daddy, and the dog we're going to get." "What kind of dog?" Grace asked, pretending surprise. "A big one who likes children and isn't scared of snow." Alexander laughed from the doorway. "I think we can arrange that." That Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside their mountain home, the Sterling family gathered around their tree. Emma read the Christmas story aloud. She'd insisted on learning it to honor all the mamas and daddies and babies who needed safe places to stay. Grace watched her unconventional family with profound gratitude. Alexander, who'd learned to balance success with presence. Emma, who'd transformed trauma into wisdom. Michael, who was slowly learning to trust again. And herself, Sarah Whitmore, Grace Miller, and Grace Sterling, all wrapped into one woman who'd found her purpose in protecting children and nurturing love. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, following her gaze. "How some families are born, others are chosen, and the strongest are forged in the fire of forgiveness," Grace said, echoing the words that had become their family motto. "Any regrets?" Grace looked around the room, at Emma helping Michael hang his stocking, at the photos of David and the original Michael on the mantel, at the bright future stretching ahead of them. "None," she said firmly. "Not a single one." Outside, the winter wind carried the promise of spring, and inside, love had transformed a house of secrets into a home of healing. Some stories begin with tragedy, but this one ended with hope. The kind of hope that can only be built from the ashes of despair by people brave enough to choose love over fear, forgiveness over revenge, and family over everything else. At 68, you understand that life's greatest treasures aren't found in bank accounts or career achievements. They're discovered in the quiet moments when love conquers fear. This story of Alexander, Grace, and Emma reminds us that family isn't always about blood relations or perfect circumstances. Sometimes the most beautiful families are forged through shared struggles, where strangers become lifelines and broken hearts learn to heal together. Like Grace, who lost everything yet found her purpose in protecting an innocent child, we all have the capacity to transform our deepest pain into our greatest strength. Alexander learned that his billions meant nothing without love, while Emma showed us that even the youngest souls can carry profound wisdom about forgiveness. Their journey proves that it's never too late to choose love over bitterness, hope over despair, and family over solitude. Whether you're raising grandchildren, caring for aging parents, or simply seeking meaningful connections in your golden years, remember that the most precious legacy we leave isn't material wealth. It's the love we give and the lives we touch. Some families are born, others are chosen, but the strongest are forged in the fire of unconditional love. Questions for reflection. What unexpected person has become family to you in your later years? How has your definition of family evolved as you've grown older? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love has surprised you.